lonely man rescued a wounded native girl. The next day, his ranch was surrounded by an army of warriors. The morning Ezra Calloway found blood on his fence posts, he knew his quiet life was about to end forever. 3 drops of crimson stained the weathered wood where his property line met the endless prairie. The kind of blood that spoke of violence, of desperation, of someone running for their life. Most men would have turned back to their coffee and pretended they saw nothing. But Ezra had spent too many years alone with his conscience to ignore what his eyes were telling him. The Montana Territory stretched before him like a canvas painted in shades of gold and amber, the morning sun casting long shadows across the grassland that rolled toward the distant mountains. His ranch house sat like a lonely sentinel against the vastness, smoke curling from the chimney into the crisp October air of 1878. For 5 years this isolation had been his sanctuary. Now, following that trail of blood, he sensed it was about to become something else entirely. The drops led him north, away from the safety of his land and toward the territories where few white men dared to travel. Each crimson spot told a story of someone stumbling, falling, getting up again. The spacing between them grew wider as he followed, suggesting whoever was bleeding was running faster, pushing themselves beyond the limits of endurance. Ezra's boots crunched through the frost-kissed grass as he traced the trail, his rifle held loose in his hands but ready. The silence of the prairie was deceptive. It could hide 100 riders or a single wounded animal. His blue eyes, weathered from years of squinting against the sun, scanned the horizon for any movement that might spell danger. The blood trail curved toward a cluster of cottonwood trees that marked a seasonal creek. As he approached, he heard something that made his steps falter, the sound of labored breathing, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the dying leaves. His finger found the trigger guard of his Winchester, and he slowed his approach, using the larger trees as cover. What he found there changed everything. She was pressed against the base of an enormous cottonwood, her dark hair matted with blood and sweat, one hand clutched to her side where crimson seeped between her fingers. Her skin was the color of burnished copper, and even in her wounded state, she possessed a fierce beauty that took his breath away. She wore traditional buckskin clothing, now torn and stained, and her eyes, when they met his, held no fear, only the calculating gaze of someone who had accepted death but would not go gently. Those eyes were the deepest brown he had ever seen, like pools of rich earth after rain. They studied him with an intelligence that seemed to weigh his very soul in an instant. She could not have been more than 20 years old, yet there was an ancient wisdom in her gaze that spoke of a people who had learned to read the hearts of men in order to survive. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The morning air hung between them, thick with possibility and danger. She was Lakota, he realized, recognizing the intricate beadwork on her clothing despite its damaged state. This was territory where his people and hers had spilled each other's blood for generations, where trust was a luxury that could cost a life. The wound in her side was serious, he could see that much. A bullet had torn through the flesh below her ribs, and from the amount of blood she had lost, she would not last much longer without help. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a visible effort, yet she maintained that steady gaze that seemed to challenge him to reveal his intentions. Ezra slowly lowered his rifle, setting it against a nearby tree. The gesture cost him his primary advantage, but something about her dignity in the face of death demanded respect. He raised his hands, palms forward, in the universal gesture of peace. When she did not react with hostility, he took a careful step closer. Her lips were pale from blood loss, and a sheen of perspiration covered her forehead despite the morning chill. The wound was worse than he had initially thought. The bullet had passed clean through, but the exit had torn a ragged hole that was bleeding freely. Without immediate attention, she would be dead within the hour. The smart thing would be to walk away, to pretend he had never seen her, never followed that trail of blood. His nearest neighbors were 20 miles away, and they would not look kindly on a man who aided the enemy. The army patrol that came through every few weeks would ask questions he could not answer. His simple life, built on solitude and self-reliance, would be shattered the moment he made the choice to help. But as he looked into those unflinching brown eyes, Ezra realized the choice had already been made. Perhaps it had been made the moment he decided to follow the blood trail, or perhaps it went deeper than that, to something fundamental in his character that could not abandon another human being to die alone. He knelt slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a clean handkerchief, one of the few reminders of his former life back east. Without speaking, he held it out to her, indicating the wound in her side. She studied his face for what felt like an eternity, searching for deception or hidden motives. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she slowly moved her blood-covered hand away from the wound and allowed him to press the cloth against it. The contact sent a shock through both of them, a connection that transcended the barriers of race and circumstance. The fabric quickly soaked through, but it would slow the bleeding enough to get her back to his house. That was if she would come. Trust was not something that could be demanded or expected, especially not between their peoples. It had to be earned, and he had precious little time to do so. Ezra gestured toward his ranch house, visible in the distance as a small speck against the golden prairie. Then he pointed to her wound and shook his head, trying to communicate that she would die without help. Understanding flickered in her eyes, followed by something that might have been resignation or perhaps a different kind of courage altogether. She attempted to stand on her own, but the effort sent a wave of weakness through her body that left her swaying. Without hesitation, Ezra caught her arm to steady her, feeling the tremor of exhaustion that ran through her frame. She was lighter than he expected, the long journey and loss of blood having taken their toll on her already slender build. The walk back to his ranch house became a test of endurance for both of them. She leaned against him more heavily with each step, her breathing becoming increasingly labored. Twice she stumbled, and twice he caught her, his arm around her waist providing the support she needed to continue. The intimacy of the contact was not lost on either of them, but necessity overrode convention. By the time they reached his porch, she was barely conscious. Ezra half-carried her up the wooden steps and through the door of his home, kicking it shut behind them. The interior of the house reflected his solitary existence, sparse but clean, furnished with only the essentials. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with embers still glowing from the morning fire. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, while a narrow staircase led to the sleeping loft above. He guided her to the worn leather sofa that faced the fireplace, helping her lie down on her uninjured side. The handkerchief was completely soaked now, and fresh blood was seeping around the edges. Time was running short, and he needed supplies that were upstairs in his bedroom. Before leaving her side, Ezra caught her eyes one more time. In them, he saw a flicker of gratitude mixed with wariness. She understood that she was completely at his mercy now, in the heart of his territory, surrounded by his possessions. The vulnerability of her position was not lost on either of them, yet she maintained that dignity that had struck him so forcefully when he first found her. He climbed the stairs quickly, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. In his bedroom, he gathered clean sheets, a bottle of whiskey for disinfecting the wound, needle and thread, and a basin for water. His hands moved with practiced efficiency. He had tended wounds before, both on animals and occasionally on himself when ranch work turned dangerous. When he returned downstairs, she had not moved from where he left her. Her eyes tracked his movements as he set the supplies on the table and moved to the simba, kitchen area to heat water on the wood-burning stove. The normalcy of these domestic actions felt strange with a wounded Lakota woman lying in his living room, but he pushed the surreal nature of the situation aside and focused on what needed to be done. The water heated slowly, giving him time to tear the clean sheets into manageable strips for bandages. His movements were methodical, calm, despite the extraordinary circumstances. This was not the first time his life had taken an unexpected turn, though perhaps it was the most dramatic since he had fled to Montana Territory 5 years ago. As he worked, he became aware that she was studying him with the same intensity that he had observed in her earlier. Her gaze took in the sparse furnishings, the absence of personal photographs or mementos that might speak to family or friends, the general air of solitude that permeated the space. She was reading his life the same way he had tried to read her injury, looking for clues that might reveal character and intention. The water finally reached a rolling boil, and he poured it into the basin, allowing it to cool just enough to avoid burning her skin. Steam rose from the surface, carrying with it the commitment he was making. Once he touched that wound, once he began the process of healing her, there would be no turning back. He would be irrevocably connected to whatever consequences followed. He approached her with the basin and clean cloths, setting them on the floor beside the sofa. Her eyes never left his face as he knelt beside her, and he realized she was giving him one final chance to reconsider. The choice was still his to make. He could still walk away, leave her to whatever fate awaited her, and return to his simple, solitary existence. Instead, he dipped a cloth in the warm water and gently moved aside the blood-soaked handkerchief. The wound was uglier than he had hoped, but not as bad as he had feared. The bullet had passed cleanly through the flesh without hitting any vital organs, but the bleeding needed to be stopped immediately. As he began to clean around the wound, she tensed but made no sound. Her stoicism was remarkable. The pain must have been intense, yet she bore it without complaint. He worked as gently as possible, removing dried blood and dirt from the area surrounding the injury. Her skin was smooth and warm beneath his touch, a reminder that despite their different worlds, they shared the same fundamental humanity. The whiskey came next, and this time she could not suppress a sharp intake of breath as the alcohol contacted the raw flesh. Her hand gripped the edge of the sofa cushion, knuckles white with the effort of remaining silent. Ezra found himself murmuring words of encouragement, his voice soft and reassuring despite the fact that she likely understood little of what he was saying. Threading the needle proved more challenging than he had anticipated. His hands, steady enough for ranch work, trembled slightly under the weight of what he was attempting. This was not a torn piece of equipment or an injured animal, but a human life hanging in the balance. The responsibility of it pressed down on him as he prepared to close the wound that could mean the difference between her life and death. The first stitch drew a soft gasp from her lips, but she remained still as stone. He worked slowly, carefully, trying to make his stitches as neat and tight as possible while causing the minimum amount of additional trauma. Her eyes had closed now. Whether from exhaustion or an attempt to distance herself from the pain, he could not tell. As he worked, Ezra found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. The blood on his fence posts that morning, the decision to follow the trail, the choice to help rather than ignore. Each step had seemed inevitable at the time, yet looking back, he could see how easily things might have gone differently. A few more minutes of delay, a different path taken, a moment of cowardice instead of courage. Any of these might have left her to die alone among the cottonwood trees. The final stitch completed, he sat back on his heels and examined his work. It was not the prettiest job, but it would hold. The bleeding had stopped and the wound was clean and properly closed. He applied a thick pad of clean cloth over the area and wrapped longer strips around her torso to hold it in place, lifting her gently to pass the bandage around her back. Throughout the process, she remained cooperative but alert, her body tense with the wariness of someone who had learned never to fully trust. Even in her weakened state, he sensed she was cataloging every detail of his home, every possible escape route, every potential weapon within reach. Survival had become such an ingrained instinct that even gratitude could not completely override caution. When the bandaging was complete, Ezra covered her with a clean blanket and built up the fire to ensure she stayed warm. Shock and blood loss could be as dangerous as the wound itself, and he had seen strong men die from injuries less serious than hers simply because their bodies could not recover from the trauma. Only then did he allow himself to truly consider what he had done. Somewhere on the prairie, people were looking for her. Whether her own people seeking to rescue her or soldiers seeking to capture her, he did not know. But they would find the same blood trail he had followed, and it would lead them directly to his door. By morning, his quiet ranch might be surrounded by warriors seeking their lost daughter, or by cavalry troops seeking a fugitive. The woman on his sofa stirred slightly, her eyes opening to meet his gaze once more. In them, he saw a question that did not require words to be understood. She was asking why he had helped her, why he had risked everything for a stranger, why he had chosen compassion over safety. Ezra wished he had an answer that made sense, even to himself. All he knew was that some choices transcended logic, reaching into deeper parts of the human spirit where right and wrong were measured by different standards. He had looked into her eyes and seen not an enemy, but a person in desperate need of help. Everything else had followed from that single moment of recognition. Outside, the Montana wind picked up, rattling the windows and reminding them both of the vast wilderness that surrounded this small island of warmth and safety. Somewhere in that wilderness, forces were already in motion that would test everything Ezra thought he knew about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of civilization. The woman closed her eyes again, her breathing finally beginning to settle into the deeper rhythm of healing sleep. As Ezra watched over her, he realized that the man who had awakened that morning to find blood on his fence posts was gone forever. In his place sat someone who had chosen to step across an invisible line that separated the safe, predictable world from something far more dangerous and infinitely more meaningful. Tomorrow would bring consequences he could not foresee, challenges he might not survive. But tonight, in the flickering glow of his fireplace, he had saved a life. Whatever came next, that single act of human decency would have to be enough to justify the choice that had changed everything. The hours passed slowly as Ezra maintained his vigil beside the wounded woman. He dozed fitfully in the wooden chair he had pulled close to the sofa, starting awake at every sound from outside, the creak of settling timber, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the eaves. Each noise carried the potential of discovery, of riders approaching through the darkness with intentions he could only guess at. Around midnight, she began to shiver despite the warmth from the fireplace. Ezra recognized the signs of fever setting in, the body's natural response to trauma and infection. He heated more water and prepared cool cloths to place on her forehead, fighting the rising temperature that could prove as deadly as the original wound. Her face, relaxed in fitful sleep, revealed details he had not noticed during the crisis of treating her injury. High cheekbones spoke of noble lineage, while small scars near her hairline suggested a life that had not been sheltered from hardship. Her hands, though delicate in appearance, showed the calluses of someone accustomed to hard work, preparing hides, gathering food, the countless tasks that sustained life on the frontier. As he bathed her fevered brow with cool water, she stirred and spoke words in her native language. The sounds were musical, flowing like water over stones, completely foreign to his ears yet somehow conveying distress. Her body tensed as if reliving whatever trauma had led to her desperate flight across the prairie. Ezra found himself speaking softly in response, his voice carrying reassurance even though she could not understand his words. The fever broke just before dawn, leaving her weak but lucid. When her eyes opened and focused on his face, he saw a clarity there that had been absent during the worst of her illness. She attempted to sit up, but he gently pressed her back against the cushions, shaking his head to indicate she needed more rest. For the first time since he had found her, she spoke in English, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to understand. "Why did you help me?" The question he had been asking himself throughout the long night was now voiced by the person who had the most right to ask it. Ezra considered his answer carefully, knowing that honesty was the only foundation upon which any understanding between them could be built. Because you needed help, and I was there to give it. She studied his face, searching for deception or hidden motives. Your people and mine are enemies. You could have let me die. I could have, he acknowledged. But that would have made me something I choose not to be. A long silence stretched between them as she processed this response. Outside, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the prairie, painting the grassland in shades of silver and gold. With the coming of day, the relative safety of darkness would be stripped away, leaving them both exposed to whatever forces were already searching for her. They will come for me, she said quietly, her eyes moving toward the windows as if she could already see riders on the horizon. Your people or mine? Both, perhaps. I am Ayanna of the Lakota. My father is Chief Dakota of the Oglala Band. 3 days ago, soldiers attacked our winter camp. I was separated from my family in the fighting. The name Dakota was familiar to Ezra. He had heard it spoken with both respect and fear in the frontier settlements. The chief was known as a skilled warrior and a shrewd negotiator, someone who had managed to keep his people fed and relatively safe in an increasingly hostile world. If this woman was indeed his daughter, her disappearance would not go unnoticed or unavenged. The soldiers who shot you, did they follow when you ran? Ayanna's expression darkened with memory. I killed 2 of them before I escaped. They will want revenge for that, and they will want to use me to draw my father into a trap. The implications of her words settled over Ezra like a cold blanket. He was not just harboring a wounded enemy. He was protecting the daughter of one of the most powerful Lakota chiefs, a woman who had killed federal soldiers in combat. The cavalry would spare no effort to recapture her, while her own people would do anything to ensure her safe return. How badly are you hurt beyond the bullet wound? He asked, forcing himself to focus on immediate concerns rather than the impossible situation they both faced. She moved experimentally, testing the limits of her mobility. My ribs are bruised, and I have cuts from riding through brush, but nothing serious. The fever has passed. I will be able to travel soon. Where will you go? Your people could be anywhere by now, and you do not know this territory well enough to find them on your own. The question hung between them, heavy with implication. They both understood that her survival depended not just on healing from her physical wounds, but on somehow navigating the deadly politics of a frontier where her very existence made her a target for multiple enemies. Ayanna struggled to sit up again, this time with more success. The movement caused her to wince, but she managed to prop herself against the arm of the sofa. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders like a curtain, and despite her weakened condition, there was a regal bearing about her that spoke of leadership bred into her very bones. You have done enough, she said finally. I will not bring more danger to your home than I already have. The danger is already here, Ezra replied. The moment I decided to help you, I chose a side in this conflict whether I intended to or not. The only question now is what we do about it. She looked at him with new interest, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You speak as if we are partners in this rather than strangers thrown together by chance. Aren't we? Your survival and mine are now connected. If the army finds you here, they will assume I am a collaborator. If your father's warriors find me with you, they might assume I am your captor. Either way, my life depends on making sure you get home safely. The logic was inescapable, even as it committed him to a course of action that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. He was a solitary rancher who had sought peace in the isolation of the Montana Territory. Now he was proposing to escort the daughter of a Lakota chief across hostile territory filled with soldiers, who wanted her captured and warriors who might kill him on sight. Ayanna considered his words in silence, her gaze moving around his simple home as if seeing it with new eyes. The absence of family photographs, the spare furnishings, the general air of temporary occupancy, all of it spoke to someone who had already lost one life and was perhaps ready to risk another. "What were you before you came here?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. In 5 years of solitude, no one had bothered to ask about his past. The few neighbors he occasionally encountered respected the frontier tradition of not prying into a man's previous circumstances. Everyone who came west was running from something or toward something, and the details rarely mattered. "I was a lot of things," he said finally. "None of them very successfully. That is not an answer." Her directness was refreshing after years of careful conversations with people who measured every word for its potential consequences. Here was someone who had no reason to observe social niceties, no investment in maintaining comfortable illusions. "I was a teacher back in Ohio, then a store clerk when that didn't work out, then a failed farmer when I tried to make something of myself. Finally, I was a man who made a mistake that cost other people dearly, and I came here to live with that mistake in solitude." "What mistake?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He had never spoken of this to another living soul, had carried the weight of it alone through 5 years of self-imposed exile. "I was teaching in a small town outside Cincinnati. There was a student, a girl not much younger than you are now. She was bright, curious, eager to learn about the world beyond her family's farm. I encouraged that curiosity, lent her books, spent extra time helping her with her studies." He paused, the familiar weight of guilt settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. "Her father misunderstood the nature of our relationship. He accused me of improper conduct, spread rumors throughout the town. I was dismissed from my position, run out of the community. The girl's reputation was ruined in the process. She was forbidden from continuing her education, married off to a man twice her age within a month." Ayanna listened without judgment, her dark eyes steady on his face. "I came here to escape the consequences of trying to do good in a world that punishes such attempts. Now, it seems, I am about to make the same mistake again. Helping me is a mistake? Helping you is right, but it will have consequences that neither of us can control, just like before." She was quiet for a moment, processing his confession. When she spoke, her voice carried a wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "Among my people, we believe that the spirits sometimes place us in situations where we must choose between safety and honor. The man who chooses safety lives longer, but dies with regret. The man who chooses honor may die sooner, but lives fully until that moment comes. And which choice are you making now? I am choosing to trust you with my life, just as you chose to trust me with yours when you brought me into your home. Whatever comes of that choice, we will face it together." The simple declaration carried the weight of a formal alliance, binding them together in a partnership neither had sought but both now accepted as necessary. Outside, the morning sun was climbing higher, shortening the shadows that had provided some concealment during the darkest hours of the night. Ezra stood and moved to the window, scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching riders. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, its golden grass bending before a steady wind that carried the scent of approaching weather. Storm clouds were gathering to the west, promising rain that would make travel difficult but might also provide cover for their movements. "Can you ride?" he asked, turning back toward her. "If I must. Then we need to leave soon. If your people are searching for you, they will have found the blood trail by now. If soldiers are pursuing you, they will have done the same. Either way, they will be here by tonight at the latest." Ayanna nodded, accepting the necessity even though she was clearly not yet strong enough for hard travel. "Where will we go?" "North, toward the Yellowstone River. There are places there where we can hide while you recover, and from there we can try to make contact with your father's people." It was a desperate plan with little chance of success, but it was the only option that offered hope for both their survivals. Staying at the ranch meant certain capture or death when the search parties arrived. Fleeing together at least gave them a fighting chance, however slim. As if summoned by their decision to leave, the sound of distant hoofbeats drifted across the morning air. Both of them froze, listening intently to determine the direction and number of the approaching riders. The sound was still far off, perhaps several miles, but unmistakably drawing closer. How many? Ayanna whispered, her body tensing despite her weakened condition. Ezra strained his ears, trying to separate individual horses from the general thunder of hooves against earth. At least a dozen, maybe more. Moving fast. Cavalry or warriors? Too early to tell, but it doesn't matter. We need to go now. He moved quickly around the room, gathering essential supplies, ammunition, food that would travel well, medical supplies for her wound, extra clothes and blankets. Everything went into saddlebags and a pack that he could carry on horseback. 5 years of accumulated possessions were abandoned without a second thought in favor of mobility and speed. Ayanna struggled to her feet, swaying slightly but managing to remain upright. The pain from her wound was evident in the tightness around her eyes, but she made no complaint as he helped her toward the back door of the house. Every step required careful balance, and he could see that riding would be agony for her, but they had no choice. His horses were in the small corral behind the house, 2 sturdy animals bred for endurance rather than speed. They would have to do. He saddled both quickly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency while his ears tracked the approaching hoofbeats. The riders were definitely getting closer, though they were still far enough away to allow for escape if they moved immediately. As he helped Ayanna mount her horse, she gripped his arm with surprising strength. If they catch us, you must tell them you were my prisoner, that I forced you to help me. It may save your life, and leave you to face whatever consequences alone. That would make everything we have done meaningless. Your death would make it meaningless. My survival with your help gives it purpose. The approaching hoofbeats were louder now, close enough that they could distinguish individual horses within the group. Time had run out for debate or second thoughts. Ezra swung up onto his own mount and led the way north from his property, heading for the rough country near the river where pursuit would be more difficult. As they rode away from the ranch house that had been his sanctuary for 5 years, Ezra felt the weight of another life-changing decision settling on his shoulders. Behind them lay safety, solitude, and the comfortable predictability of isolation. Ahead lay unknown dangers, impossible odds, and the slim hope that 2 people from different worlds could find a way to survive the forces arrayed against them. The woman riding beside him, despite her pain and weakness, sat her horse with the natural grace of someone born to the saddle. Her dark eyes scanned the terrain ahead, reading the land with skills he could only admire. Whatever challenges lay before them, he realized he could not have asked for a more capable partner in facing them. The sound of pursuit was definitely closer now, but they had reached the rougher country where rocky outcroppings and scattered trees would make tracking more difficult. If they could reach the river valley before being spotted, they might have a chance to disappear into the maze of canyons and hidden ravines that carve the northern landscape. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Ezra understood that he had crossed another invisible line, one that separated his old life from whatever was to come. The man who had awakened that morning in his comfortable isolation was gone forever, replaced by someone willing to risk everything for a principle he could barely articulate but could not abandon. Beside him, Ayanna rode in determined silence, her face set in lines of concentration as she fought through the pain of her wound and the weakness from blood loss. Yet there was something indomitable in her posture, a refusal to surrender that spoke to the warrior spirit of her people. Whatever forces were pursuing them, they would find that their prey would not be taken easily. The morning sun climbed higher as they pushed their horses through increasingly difficult terrain, leaving behind the familiar grasslands for the broken country that promised both refuge and new dangers. Behind them, the sound of pursuit continued, a constant reminder that their freedom was measured in miles and minutes, not in the luxury of time to plan or prepare. Everything had changed in the space of 24 hours, from the moment Ezra first saw blood on his fence posts to this desperate flight across the Montana wilderness. Yet, as he glanced at the determined woman riding beside him, he felt no regret for the choices that had brought them to this point. Some decisions transcended logic or self-preservation, reaching into deeper parts of the human spirit where courage was measured not by the odds of success, but by the willingness to stand for what was right, regardless of the cost. 3 days of hard travel through the Badlands had pushed both horses and riders to their limits. Ayanna's wound had reopened twice during the journey, leaving crimson stains on her buckskin shirt that served as a constant reminder of her fragile condition. Yet she had not complained once, riding through pain that would have felled weaker souls while maintaining the alert watchfulness that had kept them ahead of their pursuers. They had made camp in a narrow canyon where towering sandstone walls provided shelter from the wind and concealment from searching eyes. A thin stream trickled along the canyon floor, providing fresh water for both themselves and their exhausted horses. The rocky terrain had helped obscure their tracks, but Ezra knew their luck could not hold much longer. As he tended the small, smokeless fire that would cook their meager dinner, Ayanna sat with her back against the canyon wall, her face pale but determined. The fever had returned during the previous night, and despite her attempts to hide it, he could see she was weakening with each passing hour. "We cannot continue at this pace," he said quietly, not looking at her as he spoke. "You need time to heal properly. My people need to know I am alive. Every day we delay increases the chance that my father will do something rash to find me." Ezra understood the political implications of her disappearance. Chief Takota would not allow his daughter's capture to go unanswered, and his response might well trigger a larger conflict that would consume the entire territory. The army would be equally determined to prevent such an escalation, making their small party the focal point of forces far beyond their control. "There is a place I know, about 10 miles from here," he said finally. "An old trading post that was abandoned last year. We could rest there for a few days while you recover strength, and if they find us there, then we make our stand in a place with walls and a roof instead of dying in the open like hunted animals." She considered this in silence, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames of their campfire. In the 3 days they had traveled together, an understanding had developed between them that transcended the barriers of language and culture. They communicated as much through glances and gestures as through words, reading each other's thoughts with the intuitive connection of partners who had learned to depend on one another for survival. "You could leave me there," she said suddenly. "Return to your ranch, tell anyone who asks that you never saw me. You might still salvage something of your old life." Ezra finally looked up from the fire, meeting her gaze directly. "Is that what you think of me? That I would abandon you now, after everything we have been through together? I think you are a good man who has already risked more than he should for someone he barely knows. I would not blame you for choosing self-preservation over a hopeless cause. This cause stopped being hopeless the moment you trusted me enough to let me help you. Now it is the only cause that matters." The simple declaration seemed to settle something between them, an acknowledgement that whatever fate awaited them, they would face it together. Ayanna's expression softened, revealing a vulnerability she had carefully hidden beneath her warrior's facade. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days before the white soldiers came," she said quietly. She spoke of a time when people of different tribes could meet as friends, when hospitality was offered without fear of betrayal. "I thought those days were gone forever. Maybe they don't have to be. Maybe people like us can bring them back, one choice at a time. Or maybe we will both die trying, and no one will even remember that we made the attempt. Then we die for something worthwhile instead of living for nothing at all." The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats echoing off the canyon walls. Both of them froze, listening intently as the sound grew closer. Multiple horses, moving at a steady pace that suggested organized pursuit rather than casual travel. The searchers had found their trail despite all their efforts at concealment. Ezra quickly scattered the fire while Ayanna struggled to her feet, both of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to prepare for danger at a moment's notice. Their horses, exhausted from days of hard travel, would not be able to outrun fresh mounts in a direct chase. Their only hope lay in the maze of canyons and hidden passages that honeycombed the Badlands. How many? Ayanna whispered, her hand instinctively moving to the knife at her belt. At least 20, maybe more. Too many to fight even if you were at full strength. The hoofbeats were definitely getting closer now, accompanied by the sound of voices calling out in both English and what Ezra assumed was Lakota. The search party included both soldiers and warriors, an unlikely alliance united by their common interest in finding the missing daughter of Chief Dakota. "They are close enough to have seen our fire," Ayanna said, her voice steady despite their desperate situation. "We have perhaps 5 minutes before they reach this canyon." Ezra surveyed their position with the eye of someone who had learned to read terrain for tactical advantages. The canyon walls rose steeply on both sides, offering no easy escape route for horses and riders. Behind them, the passage narrowed to a crack barely wide enough for a single horse. Ahead, the canyon opened onto a wider valley where they would be exposed to pursuit from multiple directions. "There," he pointed to a cluster of boulders that had fallen from the canyon rim centuries ago. "We can make our stand there. It will give us some cover and force them to approach from only one direction. A last stand, then. Only if we choose to make it one. There might be another way." Ayanna looked at him questioningly as he helped her toward the boulder field, supporting her weight when her wounded side threatened to buckle beneath her. "If they want you alive, and they must, or your father would never negotiate, then they have to be careful about how they approach this. We might be able to use that to our advantage." "You mean surrender?" "I mean negotiate. You are the daughter of a chief, not a common prisoner. Even in war, there are protocols that must be observed." The hoofbeats were very close now, accompanied by the jingle of military equipment and the softer sounds of unshod ponies that marked the presence of Lakota warriors. The unlikely alliance between traditional enemies spoke to the importance both sides placed on resolving this situation without further bloodshed. They reached the shelter of the boulders just as the first riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. Ezra counted 23 men in total, a dozen cavalry troopers in blue uniforms led by a young lieutenant, and 11 Lakota warriors whose painted faces and weapons spoke of their readiness for battle. The two groups maintained a careful distance from each other even as they advanced together, united by purpose but not by trust. Ayanna, daughter of Dakota, called out one of the warriors in accented English. "We have come to take you home." "And I am Lieutenant Morrison of the 5th Cavalry," added the young officer, his voice carrying across the canyon with military precision. "We are here to ensure that no harm comes to anyone during this negotiation." Ezra felt Ayanna stiffen beside him as she recognized the warrior who had spoken. "That is Chayton, my father's war chief. He taught me to ride when I was a child." "And the lieutenant?" "I do not know him, but his presence here means the army wants to avoid a larger conflict as much as my people do." The standoff stretched out as both sides evaluated their positions and options. The soldiers had formed a loose line across the canyon mouth, their carbines ready but not yet aimed. The Lakota warriors had spread out along the canyon walls, using the rocky terrain to their advantage while keeping their weapons visible but not overtly threatening. "You are hurt, Ayanna," Chayton called out, concern evident in his voice despite the formal circumstances. "Come out and let us help you. No harm will come to you or your companion." Lieutenant Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly unhappy with the war chief's promise regarding Ezra's safety. The politics of the situation were complex, with neither side having complete authority over the final outcome. "What do you want from me?" Ayanna called back, her voice carrying the authority of her birthright despite their disadvantaged position. "Your father is preparing for war," Chayton replied. He believes you were taken by soldiers, tortured, perhaps killed. Only your safe return can prevent bloodshed that will consume the entire territory." Lieutenant Morrison nodded grimly. "My commanding officer agrees with the war chief on this point. We need to resolve this situation peacefully, for everyone's sake." Ezra could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. The decision they made in the next few minutes could determine whether the Montana Territory descended into full-scale war or found a path towards some form of peace. The responsibility was crushing, yet he also sensed an opportunity that might not come again. "What guarantees do we have?" he called out, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. "You are not in a position to demand guarantees," the lieutenant replied sharply. "Perhaps not," Ezra agreed, "but I am in a position to ensure that this situation ends badly for everyone involved unless we find a solution that serves all our interests." Chayton spoke quietly to the warriors flanking him, then addressed both Ayanna and Ezra directly. "The white man speaks with wisdom. We are here to prevent war, not to create more reasons for it. What would you ask of us?" It was the opening Ezra had hoped for, a recognition that they were not merely criminals to be captured, but participants in a negotiation that could shape the future of the region. He looked at Ayanna, seeing in her eyes both fear and determination, along with a trust that placed her life entirely in his hands. "Safe passage to Chief Dakota's camp for both of us," he said finally. "An opportunity to speak with him directly about what happened and what it means for the future." "Absolutely not," Lieutenant Morrison snapped. "You are a civilian who has aided and abetted a fugitive. You will return with us to face military justice. Then we have nothing more to discuss," Ezra replied calmly, "because I will not allow Ayanna to be separated from the only person who can verify that she was treated with honor and respect during her captivity." The standoff deepened as both sides considered the implications of his demand. Ezra understood that he was asking for something unprecedented, safe conduct into the heart of Lakota territory for a Paula coterie, for asking for something unprecedented. White man during a time of extreme tension between their peoples. Yet without such a guarantee, any resolution would leave room for misunderstanding and future conflict. Chayton and Lieutenant Morrison withdrew to opposite ends of the canyon for whispered conferences with their respective forces. The minutes stretched by with agonizing slowness as Ayanna's strength continued to ebb and the afternoon sun moved steadily toward the western horizon. Finally, Chayton approached the boulder field where they had taken shelter, dismounting and walking forward with empty hands to show his peaceful intentions. "I will escort you both to my chief's lodge," he announced. "The soldier chief has agreed to this, provided that you surrender your weapons and accept the presence of 2 cavalry officers as ... observers." It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely but offered hope for a resolution that might prevent the larger conflict everyone feared. Ezra helped Ayanna to her feet, supporting her as they walked toward the waiting warriors and soldiers who had somehow found a way to cooperate despite generations of mistrust and violence. As they approached Chayton, Ezra realized that the greatest test still lay ahead. Convincing Chief Dakota that his daughter's rescue had been an act of compassion rather than calculation would require more courage than the chase through the Badlands. The future of the Montana Territory might well depend on whether one grieving father could find it in his heart to trust the word of a man from the people who had brought so much suffering to his own. The journey to the Lakota camp would be the easy part. What awaited them there would determine whether their desperate gamble for peace had any chance of success, or whether it would simply be the prelude to a war that would consume everything they had fought to protect. The ride north took 2 days through terrain that grew increasingly familiar to the Lakota warriors but remained alien and threatening to Ezra. Rolling hills gave way to deeper valleys carved by ancient rivers, where cottonwood groves provided shelter and fresh water flowed clear and cold from hidden springs. This was country that had sustained Ayanna's people for generations, every landmark holding memories and spiritual significance that he could only imagine. Ayanna rode between Chaitan and another warrior, her posture growing straighter with each mile that brought her closer to home. The fever had broken during their first night of travel, and though she remained weak from her ordeal, the knowledge that she would soon see her father seemed to restore something vital that had been drained by days of uncertainty and pain. Lieutenant Morrison and Sergeant Hayes rode at the rear of the column, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the earth-toned clothing of their temporary allies. The young officer's face reflected the weight of responsibility he carried. If this unprecedented diplomatic mission failed, he would bear part of the blame for whatever conflict followed. His frequent glances toward the horizon suggested he was already planning escape routes should the situation deteriorate rapidly. On the morning of the second day, they crested a ridge that revealed the Lakota encampment spread across a broad valley below. Nearly 200 lodges formed concentric circles around a central area where the chief's dwelling stood, its tall poles decorated with eagle feathers that caught the morning light. Smoke rose from cooking fires throughout the camp, and the sound of children's laughter drifted up from the valley floor, creating an atmosphere of normalcy that contrasted sharply with the tension of their approaching confrontation. "Your father has been busy," Chaitan observed, indicating the unusual number of warriors visible throughout the camp. "Word of your disappearance has brought fighters from 3 other bands. They are prepared for war if this meeting does not go well." Ezra counted at least 300 mounted warriors positioned at strategic points around the valley, their weapons clearly visible and their horses fresh for rapid deployment. The message was unmistakable. Chief Dakota was negotiating from a position of strength, with enough force at his disposal to make the Army's presence in the territory untenable if he chose to unleash it. As they descended into the valley, the normal activities of camp life gradually ceased. Women paused in their work to stare at the unprecedented sight of cavalry soldiers riding peacefully among Lakota warriors. Children pointed and whispered from behind their mothers' skirts. Even the camp dogs seemed to sense the historic nature of the moment, their usual barking replaced by watchful silence. The procession made its way slowly through the outer rings of lodges toward the center of the camp, where Chief Dakota's dwelling dominated the landscape both physically and symbolically. The structure was larger than the surrounding lodges, its buffalo hide walls painted with symbols that told the story of the chief's victories and visions. Outside the entrance, an honor guard of veteran warriors stood at attention, their faces painted for battle despite the peaceful nature of the current proceedings. Chief Dakota himself emerged from the lodge as they approached, and Ezra felt the full force of the man's presence even at a distance. Tall and broad-shouldered despite his advancing years, the Lakota leader carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to absolute authority. His weathered face showed the strain of recent days, but his dark eyes burned with an intensity that suggested barely contained emotion. When Dakota saw his daughter, still mounted but clearly alive and relatively unharmed, something in his rigid posture softened slightly. He stepped forward, his arms reaching up to help her dismount, and for a moment the political implications of the situation faded before the simple relief of a father reunited with his child. "My daughter," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed atmosphere of the camp. "I feared I would never see you again." "I am here, Father, because of this man's courage," Ayanna replied, indicating Ezra with a gesture that drew every eye in the camp to his face. "He saved my life and protected my honor when he could have chosen safety for himself." Dakota's gaze shifted to Ezra, studying him with the same intensity Ayanna had shown during their first encounter. The chief's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts, but Ezra sensed he was being evaluated not just as an individual, but as a representative of his entire race and the possibilities it might hold for future cooperation or continued conflict. "We will hear this story," Dakota announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the assembled crowd. "All of it, from beginning to end, so that truth may guide our decisions rather than fear or anger." Lieutenant Morrison stepped forward, his military bearing intact despite the obvious stress of their situation. "Chief Takota, I am here on behalf of Colonel Hendricks to ensure that this matter is resolved peacefully. We seek justice, not vengeance." "Justice," Takota repeated, as if tasting the word. "An interesting choice of words from those whose justice has brought so much suffering to my people. But we will hear all voices before we decide what justice requires." The formal council convened inside the chief's lodge, where a sacred fire burned in the center and buffalo robes provided seating for the participants. Ezra found himself in the unprecedented position of addressing a Lakota war council, his words potentially determining not just his own fate but the future of thousands of people across the territory. He told the story simply and honestly, beginning with the blood on his fence posts and ending with their desperate flight through the Badlands. He spoke of his decision to help a wounded human being rather than an enemy, of Ayanna's courage during her recovery, of the trust that had developed between them despite the barriers of culture and history. When he finished, the lodge fell silent except for the crackling of the sacred fire. Chief Takota sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the flames as he considered all he had heard. The weight of his decision pressed down on everyone present, warriors and soldiers alike, understanding that the next word spoken might determine whether they left this lodge as allies or enemies. Finally, Takota raised his head and looked directly at Ezra, his weathered face revealing a wisdom earned through decades of leading his people through impossible circumstances. "You could have taken my daughter to the soldiers and claimed a reward," he said quietly. "Instead, you risked your life to return her safely to her people. This speaks to something in your character that transcends the hatred between our peoples." He stood slowly, his impressive height commanding attention from everyone in the lodge. "There will be no war over this matter. My daughter is safe, her honor intact, because one man chose compassion over fear. Perhaps there are others among your people who might make similar choices, given the opportunity." The announcement sent a wave of relief through the assembled council, but Takota was not finished. "However," he continued, his voice carrying new authority, "the conditions that led to this crisis must be addressed. The attack on our winter camp was unprovoked and unacceptable. If such incidents continue, no individual acts of kindness will be enough to prevent the war that will surely follow." Lieutenant Morrison nodded respectfully. "I will carry your concerns directly to Colonel Hendricks, Chief Takota. What happened at the winter camp was the result of miscommunication and poor judgment, not official policy. Then see that your official policy becomes clearer to those who carry out your orders. My patience is not unlimited, and my warriors grow restless for the justice you speak of." As the formal council concluded and the participants began to file out of the lodge, Chief Takota approached Ezra privately, his expression thoughtful. "My daughter tells me you are a man without family, without strong ties to any place or people. Is this true?" "It is, Chief. I came to Montana seeking solitude, and I found it until circumstances changed. Solitude is a luxury few can afford in these times. Perhaps it is time for you to consider whether you might find purpose in building bridges between our worlds rather than hiding from both of them." The suggestion was both an honor and a challenge, an invitation to become something unprecedented, a mediator between peoples who had known only conflict for generations. It was a role that would require courage, wisdom, and a willingness to sacrifice the simple life he had built in favor of something far more complex and dangerous. As Ezra considered the chief's words, he realized that his old life had ended the moment he decided to follow a trail of blood across the prairie. The question now was not whether to accept this new responsibility, but whether he possessed the strength and character to fulfill it successfully. The sun was setting over the Lakota camp as the momentous day drew to a close, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise either hope or warning for the uncertain future that lay ahead.